Welcome to our session on trade, onshoring, and international climate policy, tension among allies. I'm Joe Aldi, a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm pleased to serve as the moderator for this afternoon's conversation. I think it's fair to say that the grand bargain that we've seen that defines international climate policy, dating back to the 2009 Copenhagen Conference and embedded in the 2015 Paris Agreement, is that each country has the discretion both in how they set their targets to reduce emissions and in the policies they choose to deploy to try to deliver on those goals. This has resulted in tremendous variation in both the ambition of goals and the policies we see in practice among major economies. And this variation has drawn heightened attention to the trade implications of climate change policy. Whether it is carbon border adjustments that impose a price on the carbon embedded in imported goods compared to those manufactured domestically, or clean energy subsidies that favor domestic production, policymakers have focused on ways to enhance the manufacturing competitiveness under climate change policy. And while steps like this can address domestic political concerns, they can also contribute to tensions among trade partners. So this session will explore the political, economic, legal, and institutional questions at the intersection of trade, climate, and industrial policy. And to help me drill down on these topics, I'm thrilled to have three friends joining me on this panel. So first, in the middle, we have Nat Cohen, who is the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which is widely recognized in the US and internationally as a leading independent voice for practical policy and action to address the world's energy and climate challenges. He previously led climate work at Environmental Defense Fund in his capacity as Senior Vice President for Climate. Dr. Cohen served as Special Assistant to the President for Energy and Environment at both the National Economic Council and the Domestic Policy Council. Second, on my immediate right is Catherine Wolfram, who's the visiting Raymond Planck Professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and on leave from her position as the Cora Jane Flood Professor of Business Administration at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Wolfram recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy Economics at the Department of the Treasury. And before joining the US government, she served as the Program Director for the NBER's Environment and Energy Economics Program. And finally, on my far right is Mark Wu, the Henry L. Stimson Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School. He's also the Director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. Professor Wu served previously as a Senior Advisor in the Office of the US Trade Representative and as a Principal Liaison to the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee. He also began his career as an economist and operations officer at the World Bank, working on water, air pollution, and rural development projects. So to get the conversation going with our panelists, I thought I'd open up with a few questions, and then I'll give you an opportunity in the last 15 to 20 minutes of our session to ask questions of the panelists. We will close at 4:45, so we have time to get back to Parliament Hall for the 5 o'clock session. So first, when thinking about climate policy and trade policy, I think it'd be nice to explore a little bit this shiny new object called the Inflation Reduction Act and the implications it has for how we think about our trade relationships in the climate context. So Catherine, let me turn it to you first, since you were in government when Congress crafted the Inflation Reduction Act.
Sure, thanks Joe, and thanks everyone. As Joe said, I was serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy at Treasury. So the main thing I was thinking about in the summer of 2022 when the IRA passed was sanctions on Russia. And we were traveling around various partners and allies. We went to the EU, we went to India, we went to Indonesia. And there was literally an audible sigh of relief that the US was back, that we were doing something constructive about climate. But there was also a little bit of whiplash because people we were talking to had dealt with the previous administration. And so we definitely got questions about, is this sustainable? Is this just going to go away the next time there's a Republican in the White House? And so I think the answer to that is probably no, that this is legislatively quite strong. And I think part of the reason for that bears on what we're going to talk about at this session. And that's because a lot of the incentives are for factories, are for new investments in clean energy technologies, and a lot of those are happening in red states and in Republican districts. So I think when push comes to shove, there's even if the Republicans control the House, as they do now, even if they control all three, I don't think that we would see the Inflation Reduction Act go away. So, at first our partners and allies were really excited by it, but then they read the fine print and they weren't as excited about it. So, for instance, President Macron from France has said that he worries that IRA will fragment the West. Both Macron and President von der Leyen of the European Commission have brought up IRA with President Biden. So, it's receiving very high level attention. What are they worried about? I think there are kind of two things that they're primarily worried about. One is that in IRA, there are explicit domestic content requirements. So for instance, in order to get the electric vehicle credits, the electric vehicle, as long as it's not leased, but that's another story, has to be manufactured in North America. So, Peugeot is manufactured in France, or BMWs in Germany don't qualify. I think the second thing that I actually think is probably a bigger deal, it hasn't gotten as much attention, and that's just fundamentally IRA is taking a different approach to climate mitigation than our partners and allies are taking. We are basically subsidizing clean energy. They've done a little bit of that, but they are also taxing dirty energy. So Canada, the UK, the EU have quite ambitious high carbon prices. And so, for instance, Boston Consulting Group has documented their projections of what it will cost to manufacture clean steel in the US with the carbon capture and sequestration 45Q tax credits versus what it will cost to manufacture clean steel in Germany, and it's 43% lower in the US. It's like not rounding error. It's a big deal. So we've heard from the Europeans a lot. We've heard from the South Koreans. I kind of wonder when we're going to start hearing from the Canadians. If you're a steel manufacturer in Canada, you'd much rather locate in the US if you're thinking about doing carbon capture and sequestration. So I will stop there, but I think, the IRA might come under attack in this table, in this panel, but it's important to remember that the US is back and we're doing something about climate, and that's great news.
So I want to go to Nat next on the domestic politics here. And after that, Mark, I want to go to you to discuss subsidy wars versus tariff wars, or just different flavors of trade wars, if you will, about how we think about how things may be evolving with climate policy. But Nat, first, you're in DC. You actually have had conversations with many people on both sides of the aisle. We tend to think of climate as a fairly partisan issue, but there's this kind of slice of climate that intersects with trade that feels a little bit different. So we'd like to hear your take on how, when we view climate through a trade lens, that may engage some unusual partners potentially when we think about politics in DC.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Joe, for organizing this, and to Salata for having us. So I guess I'll speak to a little bit of this is sort of the other side of trade and climate policy. Catherine spoke to the subsidies that were embedded in IRA, and we can come back to that. But the other piece, if you think about what's the other intersection between climate policy and trade, it's the prospect of using tariffs or border measures in some way. So some form of border price on imports. And that's the area that if you were to go down to Washington and say, what are the 2 or 3 things that maybe you could get bipartisan agreement on across all of climate, it would be on that area of trade and climate. And particularly that area of at least notionally, of putting some sort of border adjustments on imports. But underneath that sort of bipartisan agreement, I think there's an important gulf, which I want to talk about. But I'll say right off the bat, I think we've got we've got all economists, we can include Mark on the panel. So, we need to recognize we're in very much of a sort of second or third or maybe fourth best world here. So we're talking about policies that are doable and feasible with the IRA is something that We can all, be concerned that it wasn't quite perfect, but there's a political reason for that, and it was probably about the best that could get done. So when we think about trade policy, in a first best world, we would, from my point of view, every country would have an emissions trading program or a carbon price of some sort in place, and there would be clear and kind of transparent prices also reflected in, those carbon prices would be reflected in trade policies, and it would be a kind of uniform and consistent, or at least a consistent policy apparatus or policy framework. We don't have that. The European Union actually does. I know we'll talk later internationally. The European Union does have an emissions trading program, and they are seeking to put on that kind of border adjustment. But in the U.S., we don't. I was in a conversation earlier, just in the session before, and Paul Jaskow said something which of course is right, but I hadn't put it quite in these words, which is we don't have a U.S. climate policy, right? We have an IRA. We have a bunch of, IRA to some extent, but the IRA is a bunch of subsidies. We have a bunch of state things, but there's no single U.S. climate policy in place. But there's still lots of interest in using trade. So what does that look like? And where's the debate in Washington? Because I think everybody says, well, this would be interesting, but the details matter. So I think the real debate, and this is one that I think keeps me up at night a little bit. The real debate in Washington is, do we have enough already in place to put a border adjustment of some sort on imports? So does the fact that the U.S. in producing almost anything you want, steel, cars, cement, look at anything you want to look at in terms of manufactured goods, the U.S. carbon intensity, the amount of carbon dioxide produced per unit of that good, is going to be less in the U.S. than it would be, let's say, in China or in India and most of our trading partners. So there are some folks who say, wow, that's a carbon advantage that we should have reflected in our policy. And if somebody wants to export something, some steel or cement or a car or whatever it is that has a higher carbon intensity, we should charge them for that because we have a lower carbon intensity. And that sounds, maybe fine on its face, except for the fact that doesn't put any requirements or any new regulatory requirements or performance requirements on U.S. firms. So the other view would be, well, really this is not just about erecting trade barriers or tariffs, but it ought to be about leveling the playing field. And so whatever we put on imports ought to reflect what we have in terms of policies here in the U.S. And so those two views, I think, are reflected right now in two different kind of bills or pieces of legislation are being worked on. Senator Cassidy on the Republican side of Louisiana is looking at something that would be like the first version I said, the former version that basically encapsulates the fact, okay, we have lower emissions, let's put a fee or a tariff on imports with higher emissions. And Senator Whitehouse has something that would say, essentially, we'll do that, but we'll also put that same fee on any domestic producers that exceed some carbon performance standard. So I think, in summary, there's a lot of interest in doing something on climate and trade because it feels like a way to reflect I think it feels for both sides of the aisle like a way to reflect the fact that the U.S. Does generally have a lower carbon intensity and maybe a way to limit the import of higher carbon goods. But the key debate really is about whether that needs to reflect domestic policy or whether that could just be on the basis of existing conditions. And I'm not a lawyer. We could get into the WTO aspects of that later. But I think whether whether trade policy will be a lever for being more ambitious in the U.S. and really increasing, putting more policies in place that would reduce emissions here, or whether it's just a barrier to keep out imports from other countries, I think that's going to be the key issue at stake.
Okay, so fortunately, we do have someone from Harvard Law School on this panel. And Mark, I'd like to go to you next and have your take. We heard a little bit about, we have this ambitious program for subsidies through the Inflation Reduction Act. Various governments, including the U.S. government, have had subsidies for clean energy before. Some subsidies are sort of better through a trade law lens than others. So maybe it's okay to subsidize building new renewable power in your country. It's another question if you mandate that the components are all domestically manufactured. That's at least one argument that's been made, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And then there's this question of this other potential policy tool, which is that we would do a carbon border adjustment. I'd like to get a sense from you too of like, where do we think that stands under trade law? And then maybe at the end, you could tell us whether or not we should care about trade law anymore, because it's not clear that the leadership in Washington cares that much about trade law anymore. So with that, let me turn it over to you to hear your take on subsidies, carbon border adjustments, and then sort of the future of trade law.
Sure. Thanks, Joe, and great to be on this panel with all of you. So it's rare as an academic you write one of these pieces and then you get a chance to sort of say, I told you so. But 8 years ago, my co-author, Jim Salzman, and I guess maybe 9 years now, we wrote a piece that said basically green industrial policies were going to be the future of trade and environment conflicts. And that really has come to bear. And the reason we predicted this was we said, look, if you look at the policies that are going to be necessary in order to get the domestic coalition together to really mobilize behind clean energy policies, it's not really just all about price. It's also about jobs. It's also about security. And so therefore, countries are going to want to put in industrial policies to make sure that some of these goods are made there in their own countries, and that they're going to be moving the more value-added parts of the value chain into their domestic manufacturing capabilities. And the country that we could see that was doing this perhaps with the longest term vision and what sparked our article was China, because China had been doing this already for the better part of a decade. And they have continued to do this, and they've really played the long game at it. So you see this use of subsidies, you see a use of export restrictions, you see a use of government procurement, a whole set of different types of tools. And now we're talking about carbon border adjustments. But originally back then, the emissions trading scheme and so forth. And certainly there's a climate impact, there's a jobs impact, there's a security impact when it comes to all these different policies. Now, to your first question on subsidies, under WTO law, and I'll come to the whole question as to whether that should matter or not, and it really depends on what you think your different, how you would order your priorities in terms of global governance now. But when it comes to WTO laws, subsidies are not permissible if they're trade distortive. So for many smaller developing countries, you don't have a scale or anything that allows it to be trade distortive. But once you talk about any of the major powers, whether you're talking about US, EU, but even Brazil, Indonesia, and so forth, right? You've got a scale there to be able to move markets, so it can be trade distortive. And then there's a whole series of different types of rules, legal requirements that need to be met in order to consider whether or not that subsidy qualifies as to what the legal definition of a subsidy is under WTO law. And so there have been various different cases that have been brought to challenge those. There have been also cases brought against export restrictions and so forth. But the key part about WTO law is that even when you lose a case, unlike other types of legal systems, you don't pay damages for past harm, and you just basically need to take away the offensive policies. So in many of these industries, these are high fixed cost industries where, you know, for those of you in the business sector, you know, right, once you've sunk that in, your industrial policy has largely succeeded, even if the subsidy then eventually disappeared. And then you've got other tools you can use at your disposal. And so that's why I think, in many sense, China's really scaled this up. They have an ability to deploy subsidies, including informally, that other countries can't. And if you look at the scale of investments, last year, China invested more than the US and Europe combined. All right, so just get a sense of just how large that industrial policy is here at work. And so I think you've got two different responses, as Catherine has pointed out, right? How the EU has approached it and how the US has. But what I would basically say the US approach has been basically, look, there needs to be some involvement on this subsidies game as well. Otherwise, all of the investment flows in the new job creating industries is flowing largely to China, especially with the large scale of deployment that's occurring there. And so that was true of solar, of wind, but increasingly also of batteries, of EVs, and so forth. And so that's really sort of the backstory behind this industrial policy race and why you see the trade tensions. But I don't think the allies are on the same page about how they want to respond to this type of threat. And they're certainly not on the same page about to what extent WTO rules should constrain their behavior.
Okay, so let me ask, and I want to hear from each of the panelists on this. Right before lunch, President Bacow asked Secretary Kerry about the battery manufacturing conditions in the Inflation Reduction Act and how some of the EU member states were upset about this. And as someone who used to advise the Secretary of the Treasury, as someone who's been involved in the international climate negotiations, as well as advising in the White House, as someone who's been involved advising the U.S. Trade Representative, I'd like to hear your thoughts on Secretary Kerry's response, which is he says that our message is to tell the Europeans to go do the same thing, and says the EU also has significant subsidies in their system. So should we be encouraging a subsidy war, as some people are terming this, where China's been doing this for a while, the US now has the IRA doing this, and what we should just be saying is to everybody should be going out and subsidizing clean energy aggressively? Catherine?
Yeah, I have a whole lot of respect for Secretary Kerry. I think there are a couple problems with the go out and do it yourselves. I think on the one hand, asking India to solve climate change or address climate change with subsidies is asking a lot. The Indian government has a lot of other demands for its revenues. The efficiency of tax collection in places like India isn't what it is in other places. So I think in the ideal world, the US and the EU subsidize clean technologies, we drive things down the learning curve, and then it becomes economic for India to make to adopt the technologies, and so it doesn't have to embrace the subsidies quite to the same extent. I think that the same issues that confront India in terms of the expenses of subsidies confront the US. We're in a period of rising interest rates. We're in a period where people are really worried about deficits. I mean, right now, the president is meeting with the leadership of Congress to talk about debt and deficits. So, I think that subsidies come with a price for everybody. In the EU, I'm not an EU specialist, but I think that the ability for member states to subsidize is complicated and it varies. It's much easier for Germany and France to weather those costs than it is for some of the smaller member states. So I think the fiscal costs are problematic. I guess on the other side of things, there are good subsidy races and there are bad subsidy races. A good subsidy race is if we're all throwing lots of money towards nascent clean energies and we are driving things down learning curves. A bad subsidy race is that we're all throwing money at like lithium and we're just driving up the price for lithium and we're transferring money to China. So I think we need to be kind of conscious about what the outcomes of the subsidy races are. I think there's been a lot of discussion that's kind of said subsidy races are good, but not all subsidy races are good.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say something heterodox that could get me kicked out of like the economics club, and then I'm going to say something orthodox to get back in. So the heterodox piece is, I've said at the outset that we're in a second best or third or fourth best world. And so we can all grant that the subsidies approach and the domestic content approach of the IRA is not the way we would design something in the first best world. But it's also true that for any policy, for any climate policy to work in the US, it has to be politically durable and it has to be politically sustainable. So we do need to think about the political economy here. And the easiest thing I think about is if can you imagine a climate policy that encouraged widespread electrification of vehicles and therefore the replacement of internal combustion engines, at least for light duty vehicles, with electric vehicles. That, ask any climate expert, they'll say, yeah, that's got to happen. Can you imagine that happening in the US and having that mean the demise of the US automotive industry and having all those EVs produced elsewhere? I don't think you can. I think that would be bad policy for the U.S. So there is a tension here. We don't want to go so far in the direction of saying, well, if all the big three automakers, if all the EVs get produced somewhere else, that's going to be fine. So that's the sort of heterodox piece, which is that we do need to think about the political economy here and about durable policy. But now let me be a little bit more orthodox, because what I worry about is not so much, we're deviating from sort of the kind of neoliberal, I count myself as neoliberal proudly, but we're not in the fullest sense of the word. Sorry, not in like the Friedmanite, Hayek sense of the world. But I do think that we should be a little bit more relaxed on how we think about things like industrial policy and subsidies. Having said that, what I worry about is not so much that we're doing a little bit of that. What I worry about is that we are kind of throwing out the rules-based multilateral order on trade, even as we're trying to build it on climate. So brief digression, I've been involved in trade and climate conversations at the World Economic Forum and others for a while. And 10 years ago, I remember being part of one. And the sense was it was the high priest of the WTO, and they were gathering everybody in Geneva and inviting some climate experts so that they could talk to the climate experts and find out what the climate people thought. But they were the WTO, and they were clearly the ascendant multilateral regime. And maybe at some point, the climate folks would get around and doing something. And now we have something very, very different. Everybody likes to talk about climate. We can talk about the Paris Agreement, but there's a reasonably robust framework in place. And the WTO feels like it's in danger of falling apart, in part because another anecdote, we have folks, you were at the USTR. When I was in the White House in 2011, 2012, one of the things I had to do was try to mediate a dispute between U.S. Trade Representative's Office and Department of Energy. Because Department of Energy had something called Sunshot. They were going to try to get the cost of solar power down to $1 a watt. And they wanted to do some really minor, it was like a whiff of local content. It was, sort of the vaguest sense of local content. And USTR was like, no. And I said, well, can we mediate? And it was just USTR came down on them like a ton of bricks, and DOE eventually just had to completely pull that back and give up. And we're in a very different world right now. I think the current USTR, from what I see, does not see a lot of value in the rules-based multilateral order and in WTO. And so I worry more, in other words, about throwing everything out, sort of throwing out that whole piece, and sort of not worrying about the WTO at all. So let me close with one last point, because there is a positive value of trade here that we haven't talked about. We've talked about subsidies and whether that's a problem. We've talked about border adjustments. But if you look at why the cost of solar has come down so far in the U.S., it's because China mass-produced solar panels at a much lower cost than anybody could, and we bought them from China. And so that was a story about trade. It was also a story about China subsidizing their manufacturers and a whole bunch of things, but it was a story about trade. If you think about critical minerals and where we're going to get our cobalt or lithium or other things, it's not going to be all from the U.S. So we're going to need to have trade policy in place for that. And so we ought to be thinking also about the constructive, positive elements of trade in terms of climate goals as well. Mark?
So you'll see why I teach at a law school rather than at our economics department. And that's because I think the first part of what Nat said, even if it's heterodox within the neoliberal school, is the way we are moving towards thinking about the economic welfare function when it comes to these types of issues on green industrial policy. So I think the reality is, right, China especially has been throwing subsidies that have driven down the cost curve for various sets of industries, whether it's solar and now especially batteries. And it's for the reason Nat was discussing, right? They're looking to deploy at scale, but they're also looking to capture the industries of the future. And so the question, I think, for many of you is looking at it from a pure orthodox economic welfare function. Is that a good thing, right? Which you might say it is. But if you look at it from this alternative view, looking at it in terms of what does this do for communities? What does this do for jobs? What does this do for security? What does this do to political willingness in order to just deploy and so forth, right? So if you expand that welfare function, then it becomes much less the case. So I think it does come down to this political economy choice of how much should we be applauding versus being concerned about that? And that determines the answer to your question there. I put myself much more in the concern category for the political economy reasons that Nat's talking about, because I can't see how, if that's the case, right, if this leads to the demise of the US car industry, if most EV batteries, that's the highest value added content, part of that is going to be captured by a Chinese state-owned battery maker, right? How we're going to be engineering the type of revolution in this industry that we're all seeking to transform about. So I think there needs to be some form of diversification. How do you make that happen? Well, if one side is employing subsidies, then I think you need to drive the cost curve equation down for investors some way, one way or the other, right? So if it's not talking about subsidies, it's got to be something else that drives down the cost curves from an investment function standpoint. I don't think that means the U.S. has given up on the rules-based international order altogether, but I think what it does highlight is really the debate is not about updating trade rules for climate change. It's first and foremost about updating trade rules to deal with industrial subsidies from non-market economies. And so until that's done, right, you're going to have the great big subsidies race going on because China and other non-market economies, right, are determined to capture these because they see these as the high value added industries of the future that are going to be job creating and allow them to leapfrog. And so as long as that's going on, right, you're going to need some form of a policy response that drives down the cost curve for investors.
So a comment I'd like to make on the solar story. We certainly saw generous subsidies, sufficiently generous that both Washington and Brussels imposed tariffs on solar modules manufactured in China, but generous production subsidies. We also had, going back almost 20 years ago, very generous subsidies on the consumption of solar power. The investment in solar in Germany, very high feed-in tariffs. My understanding is at the time, the Germans thought that would enable them to grow out their solar manufacturing industry. One of our former doctoral students, Todd Jordan, did a really nice dissertation showing how the US and Japan and other parts of the world really benefited from those German subsidies. They built out enough of a market for the manufacturers to make investments to improve the efficiency of solar panels. And in fact, over the last 5 years of his sample, he estimated that maybe 75% of the benefits of the German subsidies in driving down costs were actually enjoyed by non-German consumers. And I would actually argue that India isn't as aggressive today in its solar goals if it weren't for the combination of both producer subsidies and consumer subsidies driving down the cost of solar. And so one question is, do we, as we see this kind of focus on domestic production, whether it's here under the US and the IRA, whether we think about it with some other countries, say in the EU, that are frustrated with what the US is doing, do we see concerns among developing countries that feel like they're not going to have an opportunity to have development in clean energy technologies because of what some of the more developed, wealthier countries are doing to subsidize these technologies? Do we think we're going to see countries erect barriers and limit this opportunity for trade to help facilitate decarbonization when we think about trade in clean energy technologies? Or do we think we're going to have some fights, we're going to have a lot of diplomatic back and forth, but at the end of the day, the benefits, whether it's economic benefits of adopting cheap technology, the climate and local air pollution benefits of adopting clean energy technology manufactured somewhere else, do we think we'll still be able to see this kind of trade evolve as we hopefully bid down the cost of these new technologies through subsidies? What do we think is sort of the likelihood going forward on this?
I'll start with two observations, right? One is I do think the competition is going to drive down costs, it's going to drive innovation. So I think that's the good news part of this, right? Because you have folks realizing, right, that there does need to be a focus on and massive commitment to all this. But I think developing countries realize that as long as you have these large giants throwing this amount of money, there's no way they can compete on that scale. So even throwing up barriers, even putting in local content requirements as India tried to do, which was not successful at driving the industry over because they weren't able to compete with either the European or the Chinese subsidies at scale, right? And so I think people have really learned that lesson, say, if India can't pull it off as a developing country, right, what's to make us think we can? So I think developing countries will increasingly look to try to think about how do they capture one niche part of this and really use the competition going on here to drive the financing terms, right? So we have another session going on next door talking about how we're going to look to finance these transitions. And so if you're going to have discrete value chains that run through, right, different geopolitical blocks, the financing part is probably going to, I would predict, be increasingly much more tied to that. And we're already starting to see that with Belt and Road types of deployment. So that's one observation. The second is, I think there are going to be tensions, particularly from developing countries, if there's a greater movement towards border adjustment mechanisms, because there's no way that they can employ a carbon-related tax or whatever other tax at that same scale, and it has a much larger inflationary effect. Right? It has a much greater disruptive effect as far as income distribution is concerned domestically and so forth. And so I think you're going to start to see pushback there, and they're going to play into this geopolitical tension here as well. So I would say that, we'll see an innovation game, we'll see a sort of a price gain, but we will see trade policy to continue to be a very contentious area in this. That would be my prediction to your question, Joe.
Go ahead.
So I'll be quick on this one. I mean, I think it's I think the subsidy, some degree of the subsidies as we saw in IRA are here to stay, right? And you'll see some response from the Europeans in some way, as we already are seeing, only because the politics of it are so compelling, not because it's the best policy we could imagine. And so I think that, and I think what will start to happen, and we're already seeing this on the part of the Biden administration, is to try to use any interpretation they can, any I don't want to say loophole, but any flexibility they have in the law to just relax the impact of those subsidies on close trading partners in Western Europe in particular and other OECD countries, and to make sure that they don't unintentionally block climate progress, right? So I think you'll see sort of the basic subsidy regime that kind of gets where the domestic content stuff gets sort of smoothed out a little bit in the back, and Joe Manchin yells and screams every once in a while about that because he's mad about that, but I think that that's sort of the answer on the subsidies piece. I think on the trade piece, I do think I think that I'm not so much of I'm not in so much despair around the rules-based order that I don't think we'll figure out ways to have some of the trade in clean energy products for sure. So I think that is something that I think the WTO looks to that as maybe a lifeline to get back into relevance. I think the border adjustments piece is the toughest one, and it goes to something I think that Mark said, because all of that stuff you can see the sort of U.S. and Europe and other developed or advanced nations kind of coming together and sort of wanting to create a kind of club among themselves. And that creates these really significant political challenges with respect to the developing world. And it's tough because on the one hand, if you're thinking about what is leverage, what are the sources of leverage to get China to do more, it's hard to think of another one other than trade, but yet applying that, but on the other hand, if you think about India and South Africa and Indonesia, other countries that really need to develop, that's going to feel like a much more blunt instrument. So I think you end up with some. We talked about, I think onshoring is in the title of this, but friendshoring, as people talk about. But that's, I think, going to be a little bit of the sort of clutch that makes this work, at least in the short term.
I want to return to that in a moment, but let me go.
I'm not sure. Can I answer your question directly? But just to respond to a couple of things that Mark and Nat said, I guess I'm probably not as pessimistic about carbon pricing in emerging markets. I mean, I think there are a lot of emerging markets that are talking about cap and trade. We saw when the EU started talking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, Turkey, like half of their exports go to the EU. They started talking about carbon pricing. So, in some ways, the ideal border adjustment is one that never gets assessed, that it just encourages other countries to think hard about reducing their emissions and to pursue those emissions reductions, and so they don't have to pay the tax or pay the border adjustment. So, I guess I think that There's talk amongst some about deglobalization and, these fragmented, everybody devolving into their own protectionist bubble, and I just don't see that happening. The strength of the economic desire to find the cheapest good, even if the cheapest good is abroad, is very, very powerful, and we're going to be trading. So I think, I agree that we need to think about ways to leverage trade in the service of climate, and not be thinking about it as a barrier to climate.
So let me follow up on these last 2 points. And after this question, I want to open it up to the audience for questions. So we can think about subsidies for domestic content, trying to spur things here, but then as Nat alluded to, maybe we'll strike a little side deal. Like we have, I think, technically a very narrow free trade agreement now with Japan, right? So the free trade agreement, which is 2 pages long maybe, that covers battery manufacturing. And it's a way to exploit a loophole in the IRA that they use the term free trade agreement without actually defining or listing what are the qualifying free trade agreements.
It's basically a 2-pager that says, we have a free trade agreement.
Yes, with this, on this one category of goods, if you will. In the context of carbon border adjustments, we have, what I see, but Catherine may correct me because she was in the government and I'm on the outside. The EU in summer of 2021 says we want to do a carbon border adjustment, and then come October 2021, the US and the EU agree on steel and aluminum, a kind of trade deal that's really kind of an agree to agree later thing, but it focused on, as we were alluding to earlier in the session, about sort of the carbon advantage and the relative carbon intensities. And when you read this, I'm not sure the word China is in the text, but it screams China. So I wonder, do we see among our friends, not if I'm going to put you at a disadvantage, I'm going to treat you like everybody else, is actually going to be the beginning of a negotiation, but maybe it helps frame how we're going to engage, say, China on this. So I want to put that out there as a premise for you to challenge, disagree with, agree with, or pivot and say whatever else you want to say. Mm-hmm.
So I do not represent the administration on this one. I think steel is such a unique commodity. I think it's really hard to draw analogies between steel and anything else. And so with steel, we started with the Trump national security based tariffs, and as I understand it, that was a huge incentive. Removing those was what brought the EU to the table. And as you say, it's like an agreement to agreement. Who knows what the kind of meat of that agreement will be? But I don't see that as becoming a model for other goods. I mean that we don't know what that is yet. But I do think steel is a very unique commodity.
I'll just say I think it's very clear. You said China might not be mentioned, but it's everything screams China. I mean, that is clearly the driving factor behind the politics that I mentioned at the beginning. That concern around China, which is pervasive in Washington, not just on climate. And it's a little tricky because on the one hand, there's some basis, right? China is by far the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. I think it now is about 27%, something like that. We're roughly a quarter of global emissions every year. It continues to grow. So we need to figure out some way to have some leverage over China, and increasingly it looks like the sort of diplomatic approach that President Obama used, that we're just in a different world now than we were, and so on. So where you find that leverage, if you can find it in trade, that feels like it's really important for the climate. On the other hand, it comes with all these other issues and challenges, especially about other developing countries. But I do think that China is the number one motivator behind a lot of it.
So we've talked a lot about border adjustments, and we've talked about tariffs and so on and so forth. But on the green steel or green aluminum or whatever else, the other thing I just want to highlight is, one can use standards. And so I do think this may not be where we're headed in terms of model trade agreements, but I do think we are going to start to see movements towards more green standards for especially these very carbon energy intensive industries. And I do think that US, EU, and others who are leading in this area are going to look to set those types of standards and standards are a permissible function to use, and it has trade effects. So on the China part, my observation is as follows, right? China has had a 2-decade-long industrial policy. It has remained consistent across 3 different administrations. They are intent on dominating these industries because it's important for them on the same 3 dimensions. It's important for the US or Europeans and so forth. It's important for them from an energy security point of view. It's important for them from an innovation, jobs, high value capture point of view. And it's important for them to have political support in order to push this forward. So I think trade policy is not going to effectively sort of push them off of this decades-long industrial policy that's remained very consistent. Was put in place even before Xi Jinping, right? I do think, though, trade policy will cause supply chains to look very different. And I think particularly in the wake of what happened with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, there's an increasing recognition on the parts of the West, along with the pandemic, that there ought to be some diversification, even if that comes at the expense of cost. So I think that's where we're going to see trade policy have the effect, as opposed to leverage against China or India or one of these other countries. One last thing is, even with China being the largest emitter and so forth, the Chinese will point out, both from a historical and per capita standpoint, they're far from that. And so these types of elements of trying to push it as leverage, actually, I think the Chinese view it as feeding into their climate justice and their G77 coalition building and so on and so forth when it comes to especially the climate negotiations.
Great, thanks. We're going to open it up for questions from the audience.
So this has been a really great discussion about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but I'd love to nail all 3 of you down a little bit with what's the chance of this happening, over what time frame, and how much are we talking about? Are we talking about a tiny little tax? Or are we talking about a really big tax? Anyone willing to make some guesses about time, amounts, and probabilities?
So what do you mean by this?
So a carbon border adjustment tax.
In the US?
In the U.S., coming into the U.S., an import tax coming into the U.S.
So I'll take the bait. I think it's, assigning probabilities to getting anything passed in Congress is a little bit of a fool's errand. But I think there's probably a 40% chance that something passes, just because I see, you just look at the Senate and you see Senator Cassidy working on this and you see Senator Whitehouse working on this, and there's a big gap between those bills, but it's not, it doesn't look to me like it's one that couldn't possibly be crossed. I think it ends up, it probably gets watered down a bit, and it probably ends up getting on a relatively narrow set of things that, really, it doesn't say China, but it's really, it's targeting that. And I think I'm not sure that, how high the fee would be. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, but it's worth mentioning is for all of this, in terms of when we're thinking about the exposure, the border adjustment piece, which is about, leveling the playing field or sort of preventing unfair, trade in sort of carbon intensive goods. That's a small slice of even of the American industrial sector, right? I mean, the set of Joe back in the, for those of us who've worked in a long time, what it was 12 or 13 years ago, Joe led the analysis of energy intensive trade exposed industries in the U.S. And it's a pretty small number of, it's a handful of industries that are really carbon intensive and also trade exposed. So at the end of the day, this ends up being a pretty narrow, it's politically great, and it ends up being a pretty narrow, a narrow application. But I would say, this certainly has as good a chance as any other climate policy passing in the next couple of years. But it might not end up being that consequential if it's sort of as much to get something bipartisan passed.
I would like to expand the definition of carbon border adjustment and say that I think if you do that it might have some legs. So taking off on what Mark said about standards, if the EPA supposedly Thursday is going to release standards for power plants, and if you make those standards tradable, like if you don't enforce the standard at your plant, you can pay another plant to do something, then you get something that's close to a price in the U.S. And right now, something I've been thinking about a lot is methane. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, basically there's a methane fee if all 50 states adopt regulations, then the fee is non-binding. So you could imagine a border adjustment, and colleagues and I are pushing for a border adjustment that does the same thing, that basically says, other countries, we want you to adopt the same standards, otherwise you have to pay this fee. So I think, being a little bit creative about what the US uses as the basis for the adjustment, I think that becomes even more likely just to expand the scope.
And to clarify, your proposal on methane is for oil and gas
right.
extraction methane emissions.
Yep, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Bob Grady served in the Bush 41 White House, and actually for 43 I was on the advisory committee on trade policy negotiation. And actually the first course I ever took at Harvard College long ago as a freshman right here in Cambridge was John King Fairbanks' course on China. Replete with sherries at his home on Thursday. Awesome. Anyway, we've been talking about tariffs and border adjustment and domestic content requirements on the IRA from the perspective of, what does that mean for the rules-based international order? We really only Mark mentioned in passing, we really haven't talked about what does it mean for consumer prices, for in a world in which, as a matter of politics, probably the single biggest risk to Joe Biden is inflation, in terms of his reelection. And it's certainly the number one concern of Americans. So when you think about that, one of the effects of, we had the existing tariffs on China that even though you would think they would have been easy for President Biden to remove because they were put in by Trump, and he was really elected for one reason, not to be Donald Trump, right? But they persist. And now, in the last panel, we were talking that some of that activity has induced the Chinese to consider export controls on solar equipment or on battery materials that will further increase consumer prices. And then on the IRA, yes, he's going to throw all this money at subsidies, but if you're going to have prevailing wage requirements or domestic content requirements, one thing those will do is for sure raise the price of the vehicles to consumers, which A, will either mean price inflation, or B, will mean less will be bought and less will be made. So the curious thing is for the president, and okay, I'm a Republican as revealed by my background, what is he afraid of? Why would he not remove some of these self-inflicted things that contribute to inflation, like tariffs, on a wide array of consumer goods well beyond just carbon related? Or why would he throw in those domestic content requirements, which are going to undermine the purpose of the law in the first place, which is to get people to buy and drive more electric vehicles? Because he's not going to have a primary on the left flank, right? He's going to be the nominee. The one way he's going to lose is if consumer price inflation is high. So what are the politics of not being more attentive to the effect of this on consumer prices?
Well, I'll take a stab at a bit of that. I think the domestic content parts, right, are so the domestic content, the additional rules around. So just as an example, if you take the clean energy tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, they all have multipliers for domestic, not only for domestic production, but also for union labor and so on, right? And so there's sort of a multiply, it's built in there, which the flip side of that means that you won't have as much of those subsidies flowing, and therefore presumably don't get the same climate impact if we're not able to produce everything locally. And the batteries piece is actually that could be a big bottleneck. I think the politics there, whether or not, I think politics there are pretty just straight up, what are the politics on the Democratic coalition? Understanding he's not going to get challenged from the left, but still needs to sort of meet, I think, that going in agreement and the understanding that the support on the left, I think, for climate policy is not just climate hawks, but it's also folks who see this as an opportunity for a broader set of goals. And I say that just not pro or con, just I think that's describing the politics. I don't know. I'll leave it to Catherine or Mark whether there's any thought about the impact of the trade barriers on inflation, which I think is an interesting point. I'm not sure that folks have thought about it.
Larry Summers has definitely thought
Yes,
about it.
yes. Yeah, I was going to say, Larry and Jason have thought about it.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, right, Secretary Yellen has also commented on this. But what I'll comment is, I I think, one lens of this, and the traditional lens, has been to look at this from cost and efficiency and adoption, right? But I think what else is going on, and there is this bipartisan view towards looking at it through a national security lens. And so when it comes to particularly on batteries, right, but you also see this in semiconductors and elsewhere, ensuring that, right, that type of resiliency and this reliance on just a single supplier or a single source, right, does not happen in such a critical component going forward, and particularly on batteries being just so key for so many of these renewable energies going forward. So I think that's what's also driving the policy here, is a security angle.
I'm an economist, so I hesitate to get into politics, but I also think there's a high cost, or at least high perceived cost, to being seen as being soft on China. So if you remove tariffs and it lets a lot of Chinese steel come in, or I think that becomes problematic.
I'm an economist. I'm not afraid to jump in on the politics.
Okay.
I think it matters who's writing it. And in this case, this was a deal between Schumer and Manchin. And Schumer has a history. Back when we were implementing the Recovery Act in 2009, Schumer was bashing the Obama administration for the fact that some of our wind farms that were being built with government subsidies had majority foreign content. That was just a reality of U.S. manufacturing at the time. And so, I think Schumer, that's part of him, is that he wants there to be more domestic manufacturing. It's something that resonates with Manchin. And that this is the thing that was, at the end of the day, a lot of people thought the deal was dead. And those two kept it going, and in a way that, I subsequently talked to some of the people at the leading trade associations who were shocked there was a deal announced, right? So I don't know, Nat, you're in DC, maybe you had inside information, but
just briefly on this, literally 3 hours before the announcement that the deal was revived, I was having a call with a couple of my board members who ran regulatory affairs for two major companies, and they both were saying, we're already preparing for December and we're preparing for tax extenders. Yeah. And that was literally 3 hours before. So anybody who says, oh, we were working on it behind the scenes with Manchin is total, that was total bullshit, because nobody knew it beyond a very small group of Senator aides.
Okay. I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to take one more question, and then we're going to need to wrap up and head back for the 5 o'clock session at Clement Hall. Yes, please.
Deborah McCoy, I'm a partner at Bain. Just a quick question. Adjacent to trade is investment capital flows, and it was interesting to hear the standards discussion, as well as the discussion about taxing dirty and penalties. So out of Brussels and built deeply into the EU sustainable framework is this ratcheting up of corporate disclosures and investors basically being forced to align their capital toward companies that have kind of lower carbon, et cetera, a series of other things as well. And I suppose from the kind of policy tension angle among allies, are you hearing any talk about that being imputed as kind of another penalty apart from the trade environment against non-EU domiciled companies? Just any discussion of that at all? Because in theory, that's a pretty hard penalty to place on companies, or they're kind of forced to align, and then Brussels ends up setting policy for a lot of companies outside of the European Union.
I'll just say very quickly, I know anecdotally I've spoken to some companies that are multinational, big companies based in the U.S. that are looking really hard at those rules, and it does impact how they're thinking about their own climate actions and climate commitments. But the ones I'm thinking about are big tech companies, and I don't know whether it would be different for some of the major industrials.
I'll just say very quickly, I taught this 2 weeks ago, and I taught it in the vein to say, keep your eye on this space, because just like when I was teaching digital privacy 7-8 years ago, I said this has the potential, but the devil's in the details, and those details have not yet come out from the Commission of exactly how this is going to get implemented. And a lot of that will then get carried out through the member states as well, right? So wait and see, but possible.
So I apologize we didn't get to all your questions. If you want to come up and walk with us and walk and talk as we go back, you're welcome to do so. Finally, please join me in thanking Catherine, Nat, and Mark.